Chapter 16. He'd woken up early. Far too early. Beside him, the restless body of his girlfriend had tossed and turned, sweaty and sticky one moment, icy and shaking the next. Come on, Owen had eventually groaned, pulling at the blanket he'd just had stripped off him. If you can't sleep, then get up. For a moment, Charlotte had lain completely still, before skulking out of bed with an exaggerated huff, her naked figure silhouetted against the windows. Owen sighed as he now watched her eating breakfast in silence. It was not the tone he'd intended to set for the day, but why was she refusing to move on? How are you feeling? He tried again. Charlotte looked at him with disdain as she chewed on a large mouthful of muesli, little flakes of wheat sitting unattractively around her lips. Fine. Get yourself there then. Owen finally exploded, picking up the cereal box from in front of her and hurling it at the kitchen cupboard. You think this is how to treat me? His girlfriend screeched as she stood up. You think this is how we're supposed to be going into such a special day? If this is how we interact, we shouldn't even be having children. Well, we're not, are we? Charlotte gasped. How about you try being realistic for once? Owen crossed his arms and stared from the scattered muesli to his girlfriend's gaped jaw. He recognised the familiar tremors in her voice, but he didn't care. If she thought this was only hard on her, then she was wrong. It hasn't worked before. Why should it work now? Sure enough, Charlotte's face crumpled. You bastard! She screamed, storming to the bathroom and slamming the door. Owen kicked the box of cereal. When Charlotte eventually emerged, her eyes were red, her expression sour. Let's go. Owen opened the front door, watching his stroppy girlfriend take note of the fact that he hadn't bothered to clean up the muesli before stomping to the car. Why were they putting themselves through this? He ground his teeth. They made the short trip to the fertility clinic in usual passive-aggressive fashion, Owen opting to turn the radio up, Charlotte just as quickly turning it down. It was only when their hands accidentally brushed against each other that the distance between them seemed bridgeable. And foolish. Can we start again? Owen offered, turning and patting Charlotte on the knee as they pulled into the clinic's back car park. I'm sorry for what I said about it not working this time. I'm sure it can work. It has to work. Charlotte pouted, fiddling with the blue sapphire ring she always wore on her right middle finger. I just wanted to have a happy morning. I need to be relaxed so my body accepts this embryo. I know. I'm sorry. Hand in hand, they entered through the familiar brown door, neither prepared to even breathe normally, lest they break the spell of calmness. Inside, they chose their usual white couch in the corner. It will work this time. Charlotte stroked her belly lovingly, as though she were already carrying their child. Owen felt his eyes well up. Of course it will. But as his girlfriend flipped through trashy magazines and he stared at the clock on the far wall, the demons of their past came back, taunting him. The eggs that hadn't developed. Tick, tick, tick. The unsuccessful insemination. Tick, tick, tick. The multiple implantation failures. Tick, tick, tick. Each attempt had left its own scar on them, and they were out of clean skin. If this didn't work, it wouldn't just be the end of their dream to have children. It would be the end of them. Charlotte? A man walked into the reception. Would you like to follow me? The man led them to a bright room. Owen watched Charlotte's eyes scan the bed she'd sat in so many times before, her fingers shakily unbuttoning her jacket. Her face was losing colour. "You'll be great," he whispered, unconvincingly. "Well, haven't we had a successful batch this time?" The doctor bowled in, bright white teeth beaming. Owen forced himself to smile. It didn't matter how well the embryos fared in the laboratory dish. What mattered was how Charlotte's body took them on. "You're still comfortable going for the multiple implantation?" Charlotte rubbed her stomach. "Yes." "And you're aware this may increase the potential of carrying twins?" Though, of course, that risk is most pronounced in women under 35. Owen saw Charlotte's mouth tighten. She was only a few months older than he was, but as each day brought her closer to her 38th birthday, the subject of age was becoming more and more sensitive. "I'd love twins," she murmured. "Good." The doctor turned to him. "If you sit up at the bed head with your partner, you can view the transfer through the ultrasound." Owen swallowed a lump in his throat. He hated this part, but he saw Charlotte nodding, so he diligently picked up his chair and moved so that he could face the screen that hung over his girlfriend. "No sedation again, Charlotte, but it's normal to experience some mild cramping. Just keep breathing naturally for me." With his girlfriend squeezing his hand, Owen forced himself to look at the black and white footage. "That line you can see is the catheter going into the uterus. And in just a second, you should see a bright white splodge where I'm injecting the blastocyst. Just give it a moment." Charlotte trembled. "There we go." A bright white mark appeared on the screen. Their future child, or children, or nothing at all. Owen pressed his lips together. Don't get confident, don't plan, don't hope. "Are you sure you'll be okay to get yourself home?" he whispered, realizing guiltily it was time he left for work. "Of course," Charlotte responded, almost robotically. Owen got to his feet, turning once more as he reached the doorway. He watched his girlfriend's determined expression, her fixed stare. Not for a second did she take her eyes from the screen. Emmett stood at the school gates, watching Nicholas bounce off into the distance. With a slight pang, he noticed that his son's trouser hems were sitting high on his ankles, the once chubby legs of his little boy having shot up seemingly overnight. They'd only bought the uniform at the beginning of the year. How had he grown out of it already? He sighed, a wave of nostalgia hitting him as he turned and walked back to his car. It didn't seem that long ago he'd been standing there proudly on Nicholas's first day of school, his chest feeling like it might burst. What had Cindy said to him that morning? "We've done well." "That's right," he smiled as he dropped his bag onto the floor on the passenger side and slipped into his seat. She'd whispered the words as they'd stayed back, peering through the windows of the classroom as Nicholas had buzzed around, introducing himself to the other children and showing off the Spider-Man collectibles that he'd brought with him. They had done well. And yet half a year had vanished, with Emmett almost never setting foot in the school again. He took a deep breath as he started the car. And was it worth it? Emmett turned the heater up and took a sip of coffee from the travel mug he'd brought with him. His career might well be progressing, but it was to the detriment of everything else that mattered. At least the previous night had gone okay, he remembered. Nicholas hadn't been too upset about him missing the football game, and Cindy had seemed more herself, chatting about her work and telling him about those awful women at the sports club. Emmett frowned as he followed his GPS out to Mount Alexander Road. How odd that his son should have to play at the ground where Natalie Gibson had dropped her two young children. As he crawled past the sprawling blocks of the Flemington Housing Commission units, Emmett thought about what Cindy had told him. The women were adamant that Brian was responsible. He had a bad temper, they'd said. The marriage was in trouble. Their theory matched his own concerns, but Brian had a sound alibi. The deli security footage accounting for his movements on the day Natalie disappeared. He couldn't have killed his wife. Or could he? Emmett pondered this as he pulled up at a set of traffic lights. Natalie's autopsy results weren't back yet. What if she hadn't died on the Friday evening? He turned into a side street and pulled up along the curb, directly opposite Daniel Norman's flat. He forced himself to let his worries go. For now, he had other things to focus on. Good morning. Emmett was pleased to see that Rosemary's brother was already dressed. Are you ready to head off? I'm still finishing my breakfast. Come in. Emmett followed the thin man through to the back of the house. Did you want a coffee? No, thank you. But what's all this? Emmett looked around at the boxes of photos on the ground. Deep lines formed on Daniel's forehead. They've released her body now, so I have to get the funeral sorted. I'm supposed to find a selection of photos for the service, but... He paused, composing himself before continuing. But how do you choose? May I? Emmett picked up a photo from a much happier time. He looked at the unremarkable Norman family, the husband and wife standing behind their 3 young children, completely oblivious to the tragedy that was about to befall them. How old was your sister there? Daniel leant over. About 9, I guess. That would have been the year before the crash. Your brother was 8, wasn't he? When the car accident occurred? Yes. So Rosemary was 10, and you were 11? Almost 12. Daniel snatched the photo back. I'll definitely include that one, but I don't know what else to choose. He swept a hand over the many pictures before landing on a small pile on the coffee table. These are all recent ones that Rosie took herself while travelling. They don't mean anything to me, but I suppose I should pick at least one. Emmett accepted the few that Daniel handed him. There was Rosemary in front of Stonehenge. There she was at Machu Picchu. There she was hiking in Nepal. Wow. She really had an amazing life. Daniel shrugged, passing a few more photos over. These were from her last trip, when she went to Vietnam. Emmett looked at the adventurous woman, beaming at him from her place in the midst of a busy market. But as he flicked through the photos, it wasn't the sight of her red hair breaking out from the traditional conical hat that caught his attention. It was the beaded wooden bracelet around her left wrist. Where had he seen that before? He scrunched his face, looking from one image to the next. The beads were square and chunky, with unusual black markings. He'd definitely seen them before, but where? As Emmett turned to the next photo, in which Rosemary was posing in front of a traditional fishing boat, it came to him. He'd seen the bracelet in the bedside drawer at Tom's nursing home, on top of the newspaper clippings. When were these pictures taken? He asked, handing all but one back to Daniel. Earlier this year. February, I think. Maybe March? I don't know exactly. It was her last overseas holiday. I see. Emmett looked again at the bracelet. He was sure it was the same one he'd casually swept aside. And had Rosemary visited your brother after getting home? I don't think so. Daniel scratched his forehead. She didn't tell me if she did. Emmett closed his eyes, trying to picture the visitor book. He was fairly sure Rosemary had visited Tom. But why would she leave her bracelet there? Was it a gift? A good luck omen, perhaps? Can I keep this? Daniel pulled a face, I suppose I can print another one. Thank you. After abandoning a piece of underdone raisin toast, Daniel reluctantly followed Emmett out to the car. How long will this take? He asked, his limp seeming more cumbersome than usual. It shouldn't be too long. And we'll make sure someone drops you back. Emmett smiled. These interviews are a formality we just have to get through, I'm afraid. Rosemary's brother mumbled something indistinct. Emmett chose to ignore it. Detective Bianca Tardio will be with us too, he said as they entered the glass building. Are you sure you didn't want anyone to support you? I'm fine. After also refusing the offer of coffee or tea, Daniel sat down across from the detectives in the interview room, timidly sipping at a plastic water cup. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Norman. We'll just switch the recording on now. Emmett sat up straighter, racing through the usual legalities before getting to the point of the interview. Can you recall where you were between 7:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. on Saturday, July 13th? Daniel stroked his chin. No. Can you try and remember? I don't know. I was probably at home, watching TV. That's what I usually do on Saturday nights. What were you watching? Daniel let out an exasperated sigh. At 7:30? Probably the footy. I think the Saints were playing Hawthorn. Or was that the following weekend? I can't remember. Okay, so you think you were at home watching football on the television? I suppose so. Bianca scribbled some notes. Was anyone with you? No. And how long would you have watched the football for? A couple of hours? Until the game was over. Can you recall who won? St Kilda, if that's the game I'm thinking of. Is there anyone who can verify your movements at that time? What do you mean? Can anyone vouch that you were at home between 7:30 and 9:30 p.m. on Saturday, July 13th? No, I was on my own. Okay. Emmett flipped to a new page of notes. And what were you doing on Friday, the 19th of July? That's 1 week ago. Last Friday? Nothing special. I think I was just at home. What were you doing at home? Daniel squeezed the plastic cup so that it crinkled in the middle. Probably nothing. Maybe took a nap, watched TV. My life's not that exciting, detective. What do you do for income, Mr. Norman? Bianca asked. I don't work. I'm on a government disability pension. It's not much, but it's enough. And you spend most of your time at home? Yes. Or with Tom? But by last Friday, you were quite worried about your sister, weren't you? You'd reported her missing that week, after she didn't attend Tom's birthday. Yeah, I was. I knew something bad had happened. So, did you do anything about that on the Friday? Were you out looking for her? Did you go to her house? Daniel shifted in his chair. I probably sent her a message or tried calling her again, but I didn't go looking for her. I knew the police were already doing that. Didn't seem much point me searching as well. Emmett frowned, remembering the panicked, slightly aggressive man he'd first met earlier that week. He seemed so much calmer now. Perhaps that was the sedatives he'd been prescribed. And have you ever met, or did you know, Natalie Gibson, the other victim who was found murdered near your sister? He asked. Daniel shook his head. I read her name in the news after her body was found, but I didn't know her before. She wasn't a friend of your sister's? Not that I know of. After going through a few more details, the detectives let Daniel go. He has no alibi whatsoever. Bianca raised her eyebrows as she followed Emmett out to reception. No. And we know he phoned her on the Saturday afternoon, before she was murdered. Yes. So that would make him a fairly strong suspect. In my mind, at least. I suppose so. Emmett stopped, turning in the corridor to face his colleague. But I still don't see him being capable of murdering those two women. Do you? I mean, physically, look at him. If he had killed them, how would he have got their bodies to the creek? You can't tell me he could lift them. Bianca frowned. I've already given you my thoughts on homicide investigations, she said, somewhat testily. Follow the evidence, not opinions. Yours or anyone else's. Emmett shrugged. Well, in that case, let's bring Tom Norman in for questioning. That's where all the evidence is really pointing. You're being silly. No, I'm not. You heard Daniel. According to him, it was Rosemary who caused the car crash. So who would have a better motive than Tom? Bianca scoffed, but Emmett gave his colleague a playful glare. You know, one day you're going to be wrong about something. He waggled a finger. And I cannot wait for that day to come. Stephen rubbed his palms together, anxious and sweaty. He'd got in early, supposedly to work through the financial and educational records of their two victims. But he'd done little, utterly distracted by the incessant buzzing of his phone. Are we meeting tonight or not? Hello? Don't mess with me. I mean it. This is your last chance. He rolled his neck, turning to the financial records of Natalie Gibson with a sigh. As he'd suspected, there was nothing much there. The mother's tax returns revealed just some meagre parental assistance payments from the government. The family's combined income put at a modest $80,000. Stephen smirked as he recalled the reddening face of Brian Gibson, as he and Morton had marched in yesterday morning, seizing the store's security footage. The way Natalie's husband had frozen on the spot, as images of him stashing cash into a sports bag appeared on the monitor. He chuckled. The Gibson family was making well over $80,000. Still, Stephen made a note on the paper beside him. Tax fraud was one thing, murder quite another. He was just beginning the painful process of looking into the women's education and schooling when the sound of Bianca's gruff voice sailed down the corridor. Grabbing his phone, he poked his head through the doorway, disappointed to see just the homicide detective and Annette heading towards him. Is Detective Corbin around? He asked. He's gone to the kitchen, Bianca barked without stopping. Sure enough, Stephen found Emmett angrily smacking the vending machine at the back of the small staff dining area. Oh, it's stuck halfway, his boss groaned as he tried to shake his selection free. Stephen smiled. Allow me. A sharp karate-style kick to the base of the machine was enough to free the chocolate bar, and the young policeman watched as Emmett sheepishly reached to retrieve it. Thanks. No problem. Stephen hovered awkwardly as Emmett began unpeeling the wrapper. Did you need me? The anxiety must have been written all over his face, because Emmett sighed, shoving the half-open chocolate bar into his pocket and leading Stephen to his office. What's happened? He asked as he sank into his chair. I may have made a bit of a mistake, Stephen squirmed. He paused, unable to make eye contact with Emmett. Since Medhurst wasn't having much luck in locating Rosemary's phone, I decided to just contact it directly myself. You did what? The colour fell from Emmett's face. I didn't say I was from the police. I just sent some messages from my personal phone asking if I could get the handset back. And the person wants to meet me this afternoon. For a moment, his boss didn't seem able to speak. His eyes flickered oddly. I probably should have checked with you first, Stephen floundered. I knew that finding the phone was a priority, and I wanted to do something more than just office admin. Why would you risk compromising a key piece of evidence? Emmett smacked both hands on the table. Why wouldn't you consult me? Stephen shrank. Do you have any idea what you might have done? Or how much pressure we're under to solve these cases? What if you've blown it? I think it's okay. Stephen slid his phone across the table. Here are the messages. The person said they'd exchanged the handset for cash. Exhaling loudly, Emmett took the phone, aggressively moving his right thumb across the screen. Stephen held his breath as he watched his boss. He knew the messages by heart. How much cash would you give me? That had been followed with a barrage of bargaining requests. I want $300. Make it $400. You're trying to rip me off. Give me $500. Then came the painful efforts to arrange a meeting. Meet me at 3. Actually, 3:20. At Macca's. Nah, actually, the chicken shop near the servo. In Flemington, dickhead. Stephen pulled his most contrite face as Emmett looked up from his phone. Are you serious? His boss's eyes were wide. You've been conversing with this person for almost 2 days without telling me? Stephen swallowed a lump in his throat. He knew his boss might be a little angry, but surely he appreciated his initiative. Sorry, he mumbled. But Emmett's eyes were wild. You've just jeopardized our entire investigation. It was the first day of the new school year, and although he was in a higher class, with a different teacher, the boy was surprised to find himself happy to be back, away from the boring old couple. Today we're making pasta frames, Mr. Ong said, handing out tubs of dried pasta shells. We'll start by gluing the shells down onto the cardboard, then another day we can paint them, and then one day we might even go outside and use my special Polaroid camera to take photos that we can put inside the frames. Will we get to use the camera ourselves? One of the girls asked. If you're very good. The boy felt himself caught up in the general excitement. He'd never got to use a camera before, and this new teacher seemed so much more fun than the old one. As the children began making their frames, Mr. Ong wandered around the room. That looks lovely, Jade. Well done. Careful with the glue there. You've probably got enough. Scott, sit down or you'll be sent to the corner. The boy was immersed in the activity when a cold rush of air struck him. He turned around to find the classroom door open. This must be Tom. Mr. Ong greeted the school principal, who was standing in the doorway holding hands with an unknown boy. Yes, he's very excited to be joining your class. From his position at the back, the boy eyed the new student carefully, taking in his funny glasses, the freckles on his nose, and the brightness of his white sneakers. I'd like everyone's attention for a moment, please. Mr. Ong clapped his hands. This is Tom Norman. He's new to our school this year, and he'll be joining our class. I'd like you all to make him feel welcome. Nice glasses, Scott goaded, and several of his friends laughed. Choose any free seat you like, and I'll get you some art supplies. The teacher waved vaguely in the direction of an empty table off to the side. But to the boy's surprise, Tom instead headed straight to the spare chair beside him. Hi. Tom turned to the boy, his smile exposing a funny gap between his two front teeth. Hello, the boy whispered, unsure what to say next. They worked silently next to each other, neither saying a word, until the bell for recess sounded. Do you like cricket? Tom asked, just as the boy was about to make a hasty exit to his place under the prickly tree. I suppose so, he said, remembering Zach and Nate playing in Maria's yard. Do you want to play with me? The boy froze. He couldn't tell if this was like the time Scott had invited him to play frisbee at the back of the oval, when he'd ended up instead being dragged along the fence and left huddled in a heap. But Tom's smile was wide, and he was holding out his right hand. "I brought my favourite ball from home. It's in my bag. Want to see?" The boy nodded, but didn't take Tom's hand, instead cautiously following him to the bag rack at the side of the room. "This is a really special ball, because it's signed by Jeff Slater, the Aussie captain." The boy held the heavy red ball, noticing the black squiggle on it. He didn't know who Jeff Slater was, but he murmured appreciatively. "Are we friends now?" Tom asked, eagerly looping an arm with the boy. The boy's jaw dropped. His chest danced a little. "Yes," he eventually managed, his lips breaking into a smile. He and Tom were friends.